Game of Thrones has been one of the most popular pieces of media throughout essentially the entire 2010s. It has been both praised and panned for its representation of women. It features a well-rounded cast of complex and fleshed-out female characters, from a literal mother of dragons to the scheming queen of the Seven Kingdoms to the first female knight in Westeros. However, in recent seasons, Game of Thrones has started to show a certain disregard for these same women's character arcs. Though one could argue the 8th season really did all of its characters dirty, male or female, Game of Thrones' recent portrayal of many of its important female characters shows them as more two-dimensional and without the agency that has defined them for the previous seasons. This ends up largely undermining Game of Thrones' initial reputation for meaningful development of female characters. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to focus on 3 main characters of Game of Thrones: Brienne of Tarth, Daenerys Targaryen, and Cersei Lannister, who have all been major characters throughout the series and have even subverted common tropes in Western high fantasy, only to meet rather unsatisfying conclusions to their character arcs in this final season. If you have any social media at all, there's a huge chance you've already seen many angry fan reactions to the 8th season. Probably many of these reactions had to do with the last few episodes' treatment of Daenerys, mother of dragons, breaker of chains, and now certified war criminal. Much of Daenerys' character, though, has previously revolved around her desire to liberate and protect those who cannot do so for themselves. Daenerys herself begins as a pawn in her brother's bid for the Iron Throne, so she knows how it feels to be completely powerless in the face of a cruel authority, and sympathizes with those in the same situation. Season 8, though, seems to throw this character development out the window, as Daenerys bears down on Dragonback towards millions of innocent civilians, and proceeds to burn them alive in their homes. Yeah, that scene. Many have attributed Dany's actions to a gradual decline in her mental stability, brought on by overwhelming grief and betrayal from those close to her. Over the course of previous episodes, she has seen her closest friend decapitated, one of her oldest companions stabbed and dying in front of her, and watched one of her remaining dragons fall dead into the sea. However, despite all these being devastating events that would significantly impact her mental state, there's been nothing to suggest throughout Daenerys' character arc that she could be driven to mass murder. Way back in Season 4, she literally locked her dragons underground after discovering one had accidentally killed a shepherd's young daughter. While Daenerys may be all about bringing fire and blood to her enemies, it has never been shown to be the case with innocent bystanders. When she crucified the nobles in Meereen, she did so because they were complicit in the tyranny that had allowed slavery to prosper in the city, and thus directly enabling its people's suffering. When she sentenced Randall and Dickon Tarly to be burned alive, she did so having already offered them terms of surrender to avoid execution, and was simply staying true to her word when they refused.
Bend the knee and join me. Together, we will leave the world a better place than we found it. Or refuse. And die.
These very actions that other characters have repeatedly referred to as brutal were taken with careful calculation beforehand, rather than a split second of madness that we see in the 5th episode of Season 8. Thus, Dany's actions in this scene seem not so much befitting of her character as just a way to move the plot forward. Rather than a character with actual agency, she's become a two-dimensional version of herself that is simply a means to an end for production. This is especially frustrating, considering that Daenerys has been a fan favorite for her complexity, and for her ability to prevail in the face of oppressive adversity. A particular thread that speaks to the power and agency once so embedded in Dany's character is her relationship to motherhood. She is the self-proclaimed mother of dragons, who has progressed from a scared little girl to an ambitious queen over the course of the series, often through the aid of her quote-unquote children, aka, to most others in the show, lizards of mass destruction. By giving birth to her dragons, Daenerys gives a more powerful, sharpened context to motherhood, which is traditionally an innately womanly role and typically portrayed as very passive or reserved. Thus, she subverts its typically softened connotations, and her ability to use this stereotypically passive role for her own empowerment demonstrates her development into a strong and capable woman in a setting that often does not necessarily allow for such. By effectively robbing Daenerys of her previous development in the final episodes of Game of Thrones, the show counters its own previous representation of a strong female character. Similar to Daenerys, Cersei is another character that uses her motherhood to empower herself despite stereotypical connotations of the role. Cersei has a very strong bond to her children, in that they serve as both a motivation for her actions as well as tools for her to enact her own will. Though one of the most ruthless and arguably villainous characters in the series, Cersei is also one of the most clever, and uses her children's claim to the throne as a vein for her own influence over Westeros. Her actions to preserve this claim are extremely calculated. A key example of this is the murder of the Baratheon bastards. Dubious morality of murdering children aside, the removal of the bastards is essential to ensuring her own children's lineage is not questioned. The bastards' distinctly different appearances from the king's supposedly legitimate children had been a key source of evidence in the struggle to reveal that they weren't actually his children at all. By doing away with them, Cersei removes a threat to her family and her own power. Later on, in Season 8, though still plenty down for some murder and destruction, Cersei's sense of calculation seems to have been washed away. Instead, her character is reduced to little more than some wine-sipping bad guy waiting to be knocked over by the heroes. Even her treachery after swearing to help battle the Night King has little to no impact, as the Night King ends up written out anyway halfway through the season. Her minor plotline of sorting out affairs with the Golden Company is given barely any screen time. After many seasons revolving around conflicts central to and often created by her family, Cersei's character is simply just there for most of the 8th season, with little acknowledgement or repercussions for her actions. It's a very anticlimactic resolution to a, at least previously, complex character. Her character arc simply trails off as she dies in the rubble beneath King's Landing, without any closure for the havoc she's wreaked for the past 7 seasons. With the cases of Daenerys and Cersei aside, though, Season 8 of Game of Thrones did manage to bring some meaningful culminations of other women's character arcs. Perhaps one of the most notable was that of Brienne of Tarth. Over the course of the series, Brienne has been the embodiment of a woman challenging the societal roles assigned to her. As with many cases of Western high fantasy, Game of Thrones uses a somewhat medieval-esque setting in which a subservient view of women is a product of the time. Women are the ones to bear children, to watch over the home, to cook and clean, just typical 50s housewife basically, while men go out and fight and provide a livelihood for their family. However, Brienne subverts these roles by taking on a stereotypically male role. She's essentially the closest thing in Westeros to a female knight, even though she resigns herself to accepting that she will never officially be a knight due to her gender, or, spoiler alert, so she thinks. Nonetheless, she's trained to become a capable warrior who can hold her own against any man.
Here's what you had to fight.
My fault.
Mine never wanted to. Said fighting was for boys.
Mine said the same. But I kept fighting the boys anyway. Kept losing. Finally, my father said, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right.
The show solidifies this fact with her victory over the Hound, one of the most formidable fighters in Westeros. Even beyond the more physical stereotypes of knighthood, Brienne proves to also be extremely loyal and a competent ally. After swearing to Catelyn Stark that she would protect and aid Catelyn's daughters, Brienne fully commits herself to this task, even after Catelyn's death.
Lady Sansa, I offer my services once again.
After years of proving her strength and capability, Season 8 finally gives Brienne the recognition she deserves as she's officially knighted amongst a circle of her peers. The scene gives a sense of closure and resolution to Brienne's narrative, as she finally achieves the title that she had always seen as unattainable. It's one of the few examples of Season 8 providing logical and satisfying character development. However, the series still manages to fumble Brienne's character resolution in its final moments. In the last episode, Brienne is appointed head of the Kingsguard, one of the most prestigious and honorable positions for a knight. And yet, we see very little of her ascension to this position. I actually didn't even realize she was part of the Kingsguard until my friend mentioned it to me. Her final solo scene shows her recording an entry in a book that chronicles the lives of Westeros' knights. No, it's not her own chapter, detailing her journey to becoming the first and only female knight, prevailing despite her disadvantages, yada yada. She's just finishing up Sir Jaime's chapter. The guy who left her crying and alone in the snow so he could go back to King's Landing to shack up with his sister again. Instead of continuing his portrayal of Brienne as a capable woman pursuing and excelling at a role atypical of most women, the show simply ties her character arc back to her relationship with a man who's apparently more important.
Ultimately, it's disappointing to see Game of Thrones abandon the seasons of character development afforded to women on the show in its final hour. The final season reduces most women on the show to two-dimensional characters with very little agency. Granted, it also does so with other prominent male characters such as Jon Snow, who spends most of the Battle of Winterfell just wandering around not doing much. But it's especially frustrating to see, as many other pieces of media and fantasy don't feature that many women. And Game of Thrones is one of the few that female viewers have been able to latch onto due to its broadcast of women. For example, The Hobbit, one of the most revered traditional fantasy works, does not actually have a female character, other than a few townspeople mentioned in passing. In Tolkien's The Silmarillion, most female characters are introduced as the spouses of other, more important male characters. Much of high fantasy, especially Western high fantasy, tends to have an issue that it is mostly male-dominated. So when very popular shows such as Game of Thrones suddenly disregard the character development of important female characters, it signals to female viewers that you don't really care all that much about how they interact with the show. So I suppose all in all, my hot take of the day is we need better women's representation in fantasy so that female audiences can feel more incorporated into the fandom. It would be nice if popular media such as Game of Thrones wouldn't completely throw female narratives to the wayside. Also, Sansa deserved better. And thank you for watching.